Well, it's time now for perspective. Over the past few weeks here in France, the word incest has been trending on social media, often in conjunction with a Me Too hashtag. The tidal wave of voices reckoning with the sexual abuse they endured at the hands of family members as children has sent shockwaves through French society, although many are quick to point out that the sexual exploitation of minors often relies on quiet complicity from those closest to them. My guest today is Michael Salter, Scientia Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24 today. Now, in France right now, there very much seems to be something of a reckoning when it comes to the sexual abuse of children. Why do you think it's taken so long for the country to have this sort of conversation?
Well, child sexual abuse, as you said, depends on complicity, it depends on silence and disbelief. Sexual abuse is very common. Up to 1/2 of all sexual assaults occur against children under the age of 16. And those sorts of epidemic levels are only possible in societies that trivialise sexual abuse, societies that have developed mechanisms for overlooking or ignoring sexual abuse. And France is not alone. You know, all societies have this challenge. And incest is probably one of the hardest forms of sexual abuse to acknowledge and to talk about. People find it very, very uncomfortable to admit that sometimes the greatest threat to children comes from inside the home.
And it's important to remember, isn't it, that this wasn't always so taboo. We have seen a few clips of a TV show a few years ago, more like 30 years ago, in which people were quite open about what we would now term sexual abuse of children. People saying things like, it's a form of expression of affection when an adult engages in sexual activity with a child. Have we really come on a huge way from then?
So certainly in the 60s and the 70s, we saw a range of public intellectuals, including in France and elsewhere throughout the world, justifying sexual activity with children. This really was the dark side of the sexual revolution, and it's a side that I don't think we've really reckoned with or acknowledged that for a long time there's been a sort of an intellectual tradition that justifies sexual offending against children. Certainly in the 1980s, due to feminist activism and social movement activism, there was a period of time in the 80s where the severity and the prevalence of child sexual abuse became a significant news story. But we have to acknowledge that in the 1990s and the 2000s, this was a period of backlash in the academic community, the intellectual community. There was a lot of skepticism and a lot of claims that the seriousness of child sexual abuse had been exaggerated. And so we're now back at that point in the cycle where we have to admit that we've failed children again, that we've failed to listen to and acknowledge survivors and the needs of survivors. In many ways, this is just another turn of the wheel. We're back in a similar position that we were in, 30 or 40 years ago. And the question is, are we brave enough? Are we courageous enough to finally tackle child sexual abuse, including inside the family, as a social problem?
Now, a lot of people on social media have been talking about how their experiences as children have gone on to affect them adversely as adults. Psychologically, what is it about being abused as a child that can go on to be so traumatic for the whole of a victim's life?
So it's important to recognise that people sexually abused as children can recover, can go on to live, perfectly happy and meaningful lives, as long as they are supported to do so, as long as when they disclose, they are believed, when they reach out for help, they receive the care that they deserve. Unfortunately, the experience of sexual abuse is to experience the imposition of adult desires onto a child who doesn't understand what sex is. They don't understand what's happening. Their control, their autonomy, their rights over their own body are being taken away from them by a much more powerful person. And that is intrinsically betraying. Sexual abuse involves a profound violation of a child's trust. It comes with a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. Kids tend to blame themselves. Children tend to blame themselves for abuse. And so this sets in train a sort of a psychological domino effect. And if that child doesn't encounter an adult that supports them, believes them, listens to them, then unfortunately the long-term effects of child sexual abuse can be very severe. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. For some survivors, it can lead to violence, substance abuse, criminal behaviour. Child sexual abuse is a public health crisis. It sits at the core of many social and health problems that we struggle to deal with today because we've failed to protect those people when they were children.
Now, I think there is still quite a widespread perception that this sort of thing, the sexual abuse of children within families, doesn't happen to respectable people, to middle-class families. What would you say to people who hold those sorts of beliefs, that feeling that it can't happen here, it won't happen to someone I know?
We need to be clear that sexual abuse happens in all families, in all classes, in all communities. We don't have evidence to suggest that sexual abuse is more common in low-income communities, for example. Unfortunately, sexual abuse is one of the offences that seems to occur throughout society at equivalent rates. And what that means is that there are a lot of, middle-class families, even a lot of very wealthy families. Externally, they seem very functional. The children might be going to school. There's always 3 meals on the table. Externally, nothing might seem wrong, but inside that family, there can be terrible things happening to those children. And unfortunately, governments have been very reluctant to intervene in incest because when we peel back the facade of sexually abusive families, this normal facade that many families present, we come across hidden secrets. And for families, for perpetrators that have resources, that have money, of course, they can hire lawyers, they can protect themselves. And so governments have been really reluctant to address sexual abuse inside the family because it's just easier to characterize the threat to children as lying outside the family, or perhaps the threat to children is online. That's much less politically explosive, and it's much less politically risky than it is to acknowledge the reality of incest.
Michael Salter, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us here on France 24. Michael Salter, Associate Professor of Criminology at the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales.